It's time to flaunt your inner designer because we're about to learn some CSS. To start off, I want to show you this website. If you look at it, well, it's quite pretty. Look at that. That's really nice. Now, hopefully in the future we can create something like this, but I want to show you what this website will look like without CSS. Here it is. Pretty impressive, right? With just CSS, you'll be able to create something like this. So let's get started, shall we? I've created here for us a simple website. Nothing that we haven't seen before. You can see that I have created semantic tags with header, nav, an unordered list that has some links, a P2 and a P tag that's wrapped in another semantic tag called section. Okay, so again, nothing crazy. If I go to the about page, it's the exact same thing except for the about li doesn't have an anchor tag. And then same with login. Okay, so let's talk about CSS. The way that we would add CSS to something like this is, well, we create a CSS file. So let's do that. I'm going to create a new file that I'm going to save. Let's call it style.css. If I save that, you'll see at the bottom over here that Sublime Text now has CSS as the file type. The rules with CSS are very simple. We essentially have a selector, and then we have these squiggly brackets, and within it, we put our property, semicolon, and then value. And then we have this special character as well at the end. And that is pretty much CSS. You know this, you can write CSS. Just like HTML, just a couple of syntactic rules, and once you get used to it, it's very, very simple. But obviously, this doesn't really mean anything, so let's write actual code here. I'm going to comment that out by, again, doing command/ in Sublime Text. You can see that the commenting is different than in HTML. And let's say that we want to make this home text red. The way we would do it is we want to select what's called the selector. So here we want to say that the H2, we want that to be red. So all I would say is H2, curly brackets, and then within here, I want to say the property. I want to change the color to the value that is red. So if I save that and refresh, well, nothing happens. And that's obvious, right? Because how does this file know that this file exists? We have to link it somehow. And we do that in the head. And we haven't talked too much about the head tag element in the HTML section. But by now, you can probably tell that head just contains information about what the page needs. Maybe not the stuff that we see on a web page other than the title, but meta tags and information that we need for the website. Okay, so in here, we can actually link to this style sheet that we call style.css with a link tag. And this link tag allows us to link this HTML file to something else. And again, Sublime Text has something very useful here. If I hit tab, look at that. It autofills it for me. These are the standard attributes that you'll see to link to CSS. So you just have to get used to it and eventually it'll become second nature. So we have rel here, which is the added attribute for relation. It just specifies what relationship this link will have. And we have the default style sheet. And then for the type, this is the media type. We want to say that it's a text CSS file. We're essentially telling HTML, hey, just a heads up, we're linking to a CSS file here. And in the href, this should be familiar. We're going to link to style.css. So if I type in style.css and save, let's refresh, turns red. And just to let you know that index.html is in the same folder as style.css. We can check it over here. If I click on exercise, you see that, yep, I have style.css with index.html. Perfect. Okay, now what if we also want to make the paragraph over here the type of color as well? Well, again, we would do the selector, and then we'll do color, and let's do pink. I save, refresh, and it's pink. Hopefully you can see that. You also see here that Sublime Text does some really nice coloring for us. So if I, for example, I put a property that doesn't exist, like a misspelled color, well, you see that it doesn't highlight it properly with the blue color, and you know that you've made a mistake. Again, another great feature of Sublime Text. So CSS, what does it actually stand for? Well, it stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And style sheets, that makes sense that, we're creating style sheets, but what does cascading mean? Well, cascading means that it always takes the selector that is at the end. And that's simplified terms, but I want to demonstrate for you what that means. So let's say at the bottom over here, I do this again. Paragraph, I want color to be green. Well, if I save this, what do you think will happen? Let's refresh and see. It turns green. And why is that? Well, because it's cascading. It's saying, okay, I'll set H2 to red. Okay, I'll set paragraph to pink. And then it says, okay, I'll set P to green. So you can see here as it trickles down and cascades, it takes the last input that it receives for a specific selector. We'll get more into the cascading effects of CSS in a later video, but I want you to understand the basic concept around it. Okay, I also wanted to show you something cool that you can do with Chrome. And we did this in the first couple of video series, but now you'll actually understand what it means. So again, View, Developer, Developer Tools. And from now on, I'll be using this shortcut to open it, and you'll be able to do it as well. And if you remember, we have our Style tab. And if we click on the Style tab, we have the HTML on the left, styles over here, and nothing for the styles. But if I now go into my home and I click on that, it'll show you color red. So Google Chrome allows us to see our CSS styles. So I can even add stuff here, and I could say background color, and let's do black. Look at that. So this is a really good way to play with your website and add colors. You can check and uncheck here. And also, if you see something on a website that you really, really like, you can go to that element. Let's try it off here. Let's go to wait.but.y.com. And let's say that we really, really want to know how this was made. We can right-click, do inspect. It'll take us exactly to that element, and then we can see here some of the properties, the CSS properties that they've used. And same here, you can see that the background color is this, and so on and so forth. Okay, let's close that for now. The last thing I want to leave you with is, what if, let's close this, what if I also want the About page to have styles? And same with the login page. As you can see, there's no style for these ones, but we want the same thing for the About and login page. Well, as you can imagine, we copy the link tag and we go to About, we link it onto here, and then login, we can again link it here. I save both of these files, and now if I refresh and go to About, look at that, we have our styles. And you may be wondering, well, what if I want different styles maybe for the login? I want this to be blue instead. Well, we can actually create multiple style sheets. So I can say, for example, let's create a new file and we'll call it style2.css. I save that, and this time I'm going to say that I want my H2 to have color blue. I save that. I go into my login HTML, and now I'll make login reference the second style sheet instead of the first one. So now if I refresh, login is referencing our style2 CSS, but all the other ones are still referencing the old one. Okay, I lied. There is one last thing that I want to add, and that is that this is the common way of adding styles. But there's actually two other ways that you won't see as often, especially when you're starting off, but I wanted to show it to you so that you're not surprised. The first way of doing it is something called inline styles. And this was the original way that we incorporated styles into our HTML. And that is by specifying within the element, let's go with header over here. We want to say style, so it has a style attribute. And then within here, we can do background color. Let's do green and refresh. And we're at the about page right now. We changed that for index.html. So let's go over here and look at that. We have the green background. And if you want to add more, again, we do color red. Let's save and refresh. And look at that. The header has the color red. And you'll see here that these ones are still purple. Well, because they are link tags and they have the default linking. Okay, so that's one way. And the third and last way is in the head, you can actually create style tags. And then within these style tags, you can enter CSS. So if you just refresh here, so we have a fresh, clean slate, I can now say all the p tags, or let's do li this time. So all the lists, I want the lists to have background color of purple. So if I now save this and refresh, everything is purple, and that looks pretty yucky. We can keep adding stuff on here, and I can say color white, save, refresh, and it changed the color to white. Now you may be wondering, why don't we just do it like this? This seems a lot simpler than linking to another CSS file. Well, the reason is that for this website, everything is fairly small. It's just a couple lines of CSS, but you can imagine with websites, as they get bigger and bigger, you'll have hundreds and hundreds of lines of CSS, and having one massive file will be very, very challenging to maintain. You can also think of it as if you were working on an HTML and you also had a team of designers that were working on a CSS file. You want to have a separation where you have some team members working on the CSS and then some team members working on the HTML. And that is a concept called separation of concerns. It's a fancy way of saying that everybody just worry about what they're good at. So HTML, just worry about text, and CSS, just worry about styles. This phrase, separation of concerns, is something that we'll encounter throughout later videos when we get into JavaScript and React. And it's a very, very important concept in web development and computer science in general. So we will get back to that, but you know that it'll be a phrase that will keep coming up. So for now, let's delete this. Let's keep things the way that we have it. Let's refresh. And in the next video, I'm going to show you a couple of CSS properties that are more exciting than just color and background. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye. And welcome back. Let's make this website a little bit prettier than it is now. And I'm going to introduce you to some CSS properties. Properties are, as the name suggests, properties that we want to change within a web page. And you might be asking yourself, how many properties are there? And as we did with the HTML section, I have a recommended resource for you, and that is CSS Tricks. This website, anytime you Google any questions about CSS, most likely some of the top 10 answers are going to include something from this website. So I highly, highly recommend it, especially if you go to the menu and Almanac, because within this almanac, we have all the CSS properties listed on here. So anytime you have a question and you want to say, what is justified content? Well, you can click on it and it will actually give you examples. You can play around with it and learn about the specific property. Just like with the HTML tags, although there are way more properties, you don't need to know all of them and memorize them because that's not realistic. That's not the best use of your time. We're going to focus on the ones that you'll encounter most often. And anytime you see new ones pop up while you're working, you can always look them up and learn about them because they're very, very simple to read into. So let's try a few of these. I'm going to start off with our style.css over here. And let's change a few things. We want to have our home be in the center. Let's start off with text align. And if I type in center and I save, my text is now centered. Okay, we also want to add a border to this image. Border, and this is a little bit unique. You can do something like this. You can do 5 pixels, which is the size of the border, what style of border you want. So you can do dashed, and then the color of the border will do purple. So I save, refresh, and we have a border. You can also do solid, and if it's solid, it's a solid border. Okay, what else can we do? It'll be nice to have an image, maybe an entire image for the website. So how do we do that? Well, the tag that we would want to apply it to is probably body. So if I go into body, and you might notice something here. As I'm creating these selectors, I'm going from top to bottom. The body, which is the parent of almost everything, is at the top, and as we get more and more specific, we trickle down to smaller elements. Again, we'll get into that in a later video, but just keep that in mind. Okay, so for body, it would be awesome to have a cool image on our website. So we can do background, and you can see that Sublime Text actually autofills or has some suggestions for us. And we can look through this and pick the one that we want, but based on the name, looks like we want background image. With background image, we want to specify a URL. In our case, I actually have on my desktop saved a nice little picture, and let's title it something simple like background image. And I got this from a website called Unsplash. If you haven't checked it out, they have a ton of high quality free images that you can use. So again, here we are referencing our, let's put this actually in here. So it's in our project folder. And then within our project folder, we can say that it is background image.jpg. So I save this, I refresh. And look at that. We have this image, but you can see that it's a big image and it doesn't fit the screen. So how can we do that? We can do background size cover. So if we do that and refresh, look at that. We have a beautiful background on our website. Okay, and let's say we want to remove these little dots next to our links. We can do that by going into, well, we want to change our LI elements. So we go into style and we can put in here LI, and we'll do something called list style, and we'll go none and refresh. And look at that. Those little pesky dots are gone. Whenever I select about, I want the cursor to not be this. I want to change the cursor to maybe have this little hand gesture. I like to call them Mickey Mouse hands. Okay, so we go into our H2 and we can do something called cursor. And let's say you don't really know what properties cursor has, or you don't even know the property. You can go into CSS tricks and again go to C, look at cursor, and you can kind of guess by the name what it does. And it tells you all the information you need to know, but you can see over here that they even have a demo of what you can do with cursors. So we want the pointer, so we can just put pointer here, save. Let's go back to our website, refresh, and look at that. We now have a pointer when we hover over about. Okay, and maybe the last change we want to do is that we want to make sure that our home, about, and login are on one line. This is a little awkward when they're stacked on top of each other. And we can do that by selecting, let's look over here. We want to select our LIs, and we can use something called display. And display has a few properties that you can use. One is block. And by default, this is actually already a block. But there is also something called inline block. And if I save this and I refresh, look at that. We have everything in line. Now, we want to change a few things here. We want to make sure that our colors are better than just purple and green and pink. And what if we want some specific color and we have a certain design that we want for our website? Well, colors are very, very interesting in CSS because there's a few ways that you can do them. And I want to show you one of my favorite websites for picking colors. What this website does, it actually gives you the colors that you can use along with a nice addition of what it will complement that color. So you can play around with this and change a bunch of criteria. You can click over here and see what color combinations work. But let's say we wanted to use something like this. And if you hover over and click, you'll see over here that I get a couple of numbers that we can use. So the first one is a hex number. So hex number has a hash and then the number associated with it. So I just copied it from the website. You see the numbers a little bit different. Essentially, they can use anything from 0 to 9 and then all the way to F, so A to F. And this represents a specific color. So if I copy this and let's make our color, let's make it the color of our header. If we go back to our CSS and save this and refresh, you'll see that our color changes. Okay, we also want the border, again, to complement the color. Let's do this border color. We also have something called RGB. And RGB, again, you see over here that there's a hex color and an RGB color. These are both the same color, so you can pick whichever one you want. In the case of an RGB color, you can do something like this. Let's say we want for our border to have RGB color of these values. So that is the value of red, green, and blue. So that's what RGB stands for, and we just wrap it like so. So now if I save this and refresh, look at that. I have a nice little outline. Just to show you of what exactly I mean by red, green, and blue, if I set all of these to 0, so that means that red is in full force and green and blue are non-existent. If I save and refresh, that is red. If I change this to green, then that's in green effect. And you can imagine here that if I change the blue to 255 and everything else is 0, this will be blue. There you go. So let's go back here to what we had before because I like the other colors way better. So let's refresh. Perfect. Now RGB lets you do one other cool thing, and that is called RGBA, and that stands for alpha. You can actually set the opacity. So with the fourth number, you can actually do something between 0 and 1, and 1 being, well, opaque and you can still see everything, to 0 where it's completely transparent. So let's do 0.5 here, and you can see that there's a bit of a fade now in our color. Perfect. So using a tool like this, you can really pick what colors you want your website to have and choose the one that complement each other well. I use this website a lot when creating new websites and thinking of color templates to use. It's a really, really good resource. And you can use hex and RGB, whichever one you want. Just it's good to have some consistency. If you want to add some opacity, so the alpha, this last number, then definitely use RGBA. Okay, so going back here, our website is starting to look somewhat okay. But in the next section, I want to talk a little bit about selectors and more things that we can do with them. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye. And welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk all about selectors. Let's go back to our homepage here. We can look at our styles. So far, we've only been selecting elements. But most likely, we need something more than this. So let's go back to our example and look at what sort of selectors we can have. Let's say, for example, that we want the style that we have for the big home header to also apply to our p tag. How can we do that? Well, we can do something like this. I save, refresh. Awesome. So that's a way of doing a selector. And there's actually a whole bunch of things that we can do with selectors. And I created for you a nice little cheat sheet here that I'll attach after this lesson. And it references two really good resources that I recommend. One is the CSS tricks that I've already mentioned. And you can see over here all the selectors that they have. They're not as many as they had with properties. And it's actually not as overwhelming as you think. Probably about 30% of these are the ones that are used most of the time. And we also have our good friend W3 Schools that lists a bunch of the selectors here. So let's go over a few things and understand the main selectors that we have. So I've listed them off for you over here, but I want to point your attention to this line. Cascading style sheets at the most basic level, it indicates, there you go, typo. It indicates that the order of CSS rules matter. And that's something that we've already discussed before. You remember the p tags. So the order matters because we know that the CSS will read the last line and make sure that the color is green. So that's the most basic level. But there's a few other things that we can do. So let's look at the selectors. The first one is class. The class will do something like this. So let's say we want to add a few more p tags here and refresh. Okay, perfect. We love the way everything looks, but ideally for the paragraphs, we want the border to be a slightly different color. So what we can do is we can add something called class. So the class property, we can give it any value we want, whatever we want to call it. So let's call it web text. Now we can copy and paste this class attribute to all the p tags. And if I go back to my style, let's make this, put it up a bit. I can now add period web text. And then from here, you can see that it's highlighted green. And we want the border to be 5 pixels dashed green. Save and refresh. And look at that. So class is a good way to select a group of elements and make sure that they all have the same styles. And we can add multiple ones. So this one can be active. And this adds a second class, which we can say has the text color red. So if we save that, save this as well and refresh, you can see over here that now this is red. So class is very, very useful. Let's look at the next one. Let's drag this over here. Okay, the next one is ID. ID is similar to class, except for you can use the same ID only once. So let's say that we want to group these p tags by wrapping them in a div. And you might remember this from the HTML section where we talked about this tag that is very, very useful for CSS. For occasions like this where we want to wrap something, so I can do ID equals div1. And if I save this, I can now go back here. And for an ID, you want to do a hash sign, div1. And let's do background blue. Save and refresh. All right, that looks absolutely hideous. You know what? I think this will look really, really good if it had a bit of opacity. So again, we remember RGBA. And if we wanted blue, if you remember, is red, green, and blue. So 255. And then we'll add opacity of, let's say, 0.2. We save that, refresh. All right, that looks a lot better. But now, let's say we copy this and we want to add a second section. Now we would have to call this div2. Again, we want to make sure that the IDs are different. Otherwise, we break the rules. Now, if I save this, we'll have something new, but no styles in this one. We want to add a different style for div2. So again, the selector of div2 will have, let's say this one, instead of blue, has the background red with opacity of 0.2. Let's refresh and look at that. That looks, I'd say, a lot better than it used to. Okay, let's go back to a couple other ones. So this is a star. So the star, it's not used very often, but it symbolizes all elements. So if I do, and usually you'll see stars at the top, but if I do something like this, I can say that we wanted to align everything. Let's say text align, and we want to do right. If I save that and refresh, now we see that this moved to the right, but these didn't. And the reason is because, again, something called specificity. We're saying that, yep, I want everything to be right. But then as we go down the CSS, you'll see that we are saying H2 and P, we want text align to be center. So these elements, instead of coming to the right, get to the center. So just to prove to you that that's correct, if I comment this out, I save and refresh, you see everything moves to the right. Okay, and let's refresh, perfect. The next one is the element, and this is something that we've already seen. You can see over here, we're selecting the element, and then we're putting the property and values. The next one is the element, comma, element, and that is just like we've done here before. We want both H2 and P to have these properties. The next one, and this is a little bit tricky, is element space element. And this is a little bit different than the top one because element space element, what it does, I'll show you over here. I save this and I refresh, and what just happened here? You'll see that now the text align of center does not apply to these paragraphs anymore. And that's because this syntax of writing a selector means I want you to select all P's that are inside H2. So now even the H2 isn't styled anymore because this says we only want the P's that are inside H2. And you'll see that we have nothing inside H2 other than the text. So if I do something like this, home gnome, I like that, okay. Perfect, I save that and I refresh. You'll see that home gnome is added with these styles. Let's look at the next one. The next one is element greater than element. So this one is a little tricky. So if I go like this and I refresh, nothing's changed, but this says that I want you to select all P's, all paragraphs that have parent of H2. So to show you exactly what that means, let's add this on a new line so you can see better. If now within this P, if we do something like this where we wrap this in a div, like so, and I refresh this, the style didn't get applied because it only wants P's, so paragraphs that are parents of H2, and this P is his parent or her parent is the div, Mr. and Mrs. div. If we put this back to the way it was and refresh, you'll see that this time it works because it's saying all P's inside of H2, which is the case. Hopefully you're still with me. This is as hard as selectors get. So once you know these ones, honestly, you've covered 90% and nothing else will scare you. Okay, let's look at one more, element plus element. So this one, if I go element plus element and refresh, what just happened? This says select any P element that is exactly after an H2 element. So what does that mean? Well, we need to make it so that the P element is right after the H2. So if I go like this, save and refresh, you'll see that now we have our styles applied. Let's look at a few more, and like I said, these ones are probably the hardest. These last ones are kind of fun. Okay, so we have hover. So hover What that means is if I go over here and I put hover at the end, this means that when I refresh, nothing happens, but when I hover my mouse, look at that. It changes the style to what we just wrote down over here. This one's a pretty cool one, especially for buttons. The next one, if we look over here, is last child and first child. And you might guess what that means. So a good way to demonstrate this is we want to use web text. So web text, as if you remember, is all these little lorem ipsums. I can say in here, last child, refresh, and only the last child of each web text. And you'll see here that there's two of them because it is selecting the last child, this one and this one. And then there's also first child, which, as you can imagine, if I refresh, it selects the first items. And then finally, I wanted to show you one last thing that I don't recommend, but you might see it in some code bases, so I don't want you to be surprised when you come across it. And that is this. So I can add something like exclamation mark important here. And you'll see again, we get that nice highlighting. And important means, let's see what happens here. I refresh and everything just turned pink. Even though this P over here says I want the color green, important overrides any of the cascading style sheet rules and says, hey, I don't care what anybody else says, the P is pink. And you can see here why I don't recommend using this. Because although you know for sure that the P tags will be pink, if somebody else comes and starts working on your style sheet, and maybe this is hundreds of lines, and they don't know that the important tag is there, they can be confused as to, hey, how come nothing's turning green? I can play all around with the color here and nothing's happening. And again, it breaks the rules of cascading style sheets. So you don't really want to use it, but again, if you see it out in the wild, you won't be surprised this way. The last thing I want to leave you with is the idea of specificity. If this is your first time running into it, it might get a little confusing and you do need a bit of time to get used to it, but trust me, you'll get there. It's just one of these things that everybody goes through and eventually you'll have an aha moment. When selectors win out in the cascade, it depends on three things. So the first thing is specificity, and I have a resource here that really explains it well. A simple way to think about this is how specific is your selector. So this has a specificity score of here. This has a little bit higher because it's more detailed, it's more nested, and this one is higher. This one is even higher, and you can see that it keeps going higher and higher. So the more specific something is, the more likely it will win out and make sure that that is the style. And there's actually a really fun specificity calculator. It's really hard to say that word. So if you click over here, you can type in whatever you want. So let's say A, for example, is just 1 point. But if I do LI, that's 2. And if I do LI, that's even higher. And if I do A, it's even higher, but then I add an ID of food. You can see that IDs are even higher. And then if I add another class, let's do blue, you'll see that the specificity increases. And you'll see over here that inline styles is actually the highest. So if you remember, that is putting a style directly into a section, that will always win out over others. So you can play around with this, and I will link to some of the resources that I have in the next section. But again, this is something that will be very specific once you get to a certain problem. You can figure it out, but I hope that makes sense. Let's go back over here to the last two things. So the other thing was the importance. Importance is, as I mentioned, this exclamation mark important. So that always depends on what kind of styles the cascade gets. And then finally, it is the source order. And that is, let's go back to our index file. If we had another style sheet here, let's say we're importing another style sheet. And if you remember, we have style 2 here that makes the H2 color blue. If I put this in, save, and let's go back to our website and refresh, this turns blue because our browser reads this style sheet and then reads this one. And because this one happens after this, the later style gets added. So if I switch this over here and I save, refresh, and let's make sure that the H2 has its own style. So let's do H2 color red, refresh. You'll see that this style wins out. Okay, I'm gonna leave this out for you. In the next section, you can play around with CSS and some of the selectors, but this is the hardest it's gonna get. And once you remember these rules, you're all set. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Welcome back, and in this video, we're gonna be talking about text and font. Let's go back to the About page. It looks quite lonely and empty right now. I'm gonna turn off the hover effect because it can get kind of annoying after a bit. Let's remove that here and refresh. All right, perfect. In the About HTML, let's try and make this text a little bit prettier. So I'm gonna do our little short command with Sublime Text. So lorem and then make sure I close off this p tag. All right, so I'm gonna show you a few text properties that we can add. Going back to style, and I'm going to remove the pink color. So we only have this p to worry about, and refresh, and you'll see here that it's still not green because this has higher specificity than this. Again, if you don't know what that means, just check out my previous video. The first one I'm going to show you is called text decoration, and very simply, this one you can do underline, refresh, you get a nice underline. You can also do line through, refresh, and there you go, nice line through. The next one is text transform, and this one you can do something like uppercase, and you can transform the entire text into uppercase. You can do lowercase with this as well, but you can try that out on your own. Next one is line height. So in line height, you can put the pixels. So we want 20 pixels of space. There's a line height. If we do 200 pixels, you can see that that's a lot of spacing. So let's keep it at 20 just because that looks nicer. Refresh, perfect. Next one is, I kind of like this, so I'm going to keep this. I'm going to add it to the bottom. The next one is font style. You can set something like italic, save, refresh, nice italic lettering. The next one, let's do font weight. And here you can actually do a number between 100 and 900, or you can do just simply something like bold. And obviously that changes the weight of the font. We also have something like font size. Obviously we want to change the size of the text, and you can do something like percentage. So 100%, if you do that, nothing changes. But if you do 150%, well, that gets 150% bigger. If you do 80, you'll get 80% of the original. And then finally, I also want to show you font family. So this is where you get to pick what kind of font you want. So if you want something like Georgia, I save, refresh, we got that nice little font. If you have something that is multiple words, you'll have to use quotation marks. So if you have something like Times New Roman, you'll have to write it like that. And a special quality of font family is that you'll see a lot of this. This means that on whosever laptop the website opens on, if that computer doesn't have Times New Roman, then print the text in Georgia. And you can have multiple of these separated by comma. And that might sound surprising to you, but fonts are simply pieces of information that each computer has, but it's not equally distributed amongst everybody. So some computers might have certain kinds of font like Times New Roman and others might not. And you can check online which fonts are available in Windows and Macs, but keep that in mind, that you want to think about fonts and how your website's going to display, because a user might not have that specific font on their laptop. Now, two questions might pop in your head right now. One is, well, Andre, what if I have this super awesome custom font and I want to use that? And the second one is, how do we make sure that a user always sees the same font on a website, even if they don't have it on their computer? So how can you do this? One way is to actually include a font file that you have on your computer with all your website files. But I'm going to show you an easy way that a lot of developers use, and it's free. And that is Google Fonts. Google Fonts actually has these free fonts that you can use, and there's a ton of them. Anything that you find here is more than enough. And I've used this many times when building websites. It's a great resource. I really like this one. So let's pick this one, Poiret 1. And you can see over here that you can play around and see what it looks like. You can also see the size difference. And if you click the plus sign over here, you'll see at the bottom that I have a selected item. And if I click on it, it shows me how I can add it to my website. So first thing we want to do is we want to copy this, and this might look familiar. And this link tag, which is a style sheet, has a reference to fonts.googleapis.com. We're saying, hey, grab the fonts before you load up this HTML file on my web page. Load it up with the fonts that are found at this website. So yes, if this website is down, and let's say there's no internet access, they won't be able to load those fonts. But it's Google, we can trust them. Most likely they're going to be online. And the second one, you can see over here what we can add to our CSS file. So we just copy that, go to our style sheet, and let's change this to our new Google font. I save that. Let's go to our page and refresh. Look at that. That is nice and pretty. Let's make that bigger just so we can see it. Whoa, we obviously need some line spacing here. So we can do line height, 50 pixels. There you go. One thing you might think about, and this is something that we'll get into in the advanced CSS section, is that by loading this, we're actually making our website a tiny bit slower, because now, in order for this website to load, we need to grab the style sheet that we've created, plus go to this link and grab our font. Again, something that we don't want to worry about yet, but things to keep in mind. And in the advanced section, we'll cover that a little bit further. But there you have it. There are your general text-based, font-based properties. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. And welcome back. I want to show you a property that is commonly used with images. So I have a really funny picture here of an alpaca. So we're going to copy that. Actually, we're going to use the link for this, and we're going to add an image to our website. Let's just make our font size a little bit smaller. Perfect. And I'm going to try and add a picture to the left over here. So if we go to our About page, and in our section over here, we can try and add a picture. So let's do an image tag. And if you remember, we have a source, and that source, I just copy and pasted the link. And if I save this and refresh, ooh, that's a big picture. So as you may remember, we have to do width. Let's do 50 pixels and height 50 pixels. Let's save and refresh. And you can see that we broke. Let's make that a little bit bigger actually. Let's do 200 and 200. Perfect. You can see here that we actually broke a bit of our CSS, and that is because if you look over here, we have used this selector which says immediate neighbor of h2. We can just do this for now. Refresh, and there you have it. But I kind of want the text to be on the right side over here. How do we do that? Well, we can select the image and use a property called float. And float, you can do right or left. So if we do left and refresh, it floats the image to the left. And you see that the text wraps around. And this property was created specifically for these reasons, to have images floating to either left or right and be able to have text wrapped around them. You'll see instances where float is being used for positioning elements, and that's not the best practice because it has some funny properties. For now, just use it with images if you can. And one thing to note with float, and just to show you that I can do it on the right as well, if I go like this and refresh, it flows to the right. I kind of like this better, so we'll keep that there. The other thing I want to show you is that if we added anything, so after the image, we want to have a footer. And in this footer, it'll say website made with love. Close that and save. And we also want to make this actually a lot smaller. So I'm going to do 5 pixels because I want to show you something. So you see over here, I've made this line height very, very small, but I wanted to demonstrate for you because this is floated to the right, everything just kind of tacks on to the left side over here. And if we wanted to make sure that our footer is at the bottom of the website, we would have to use a property that almost always comes with float. And it's usually put in the property after the float is being used. So in our case, footer. And we have to specify clear both. So if I save and refresh, we have that at the bottom. And let's align it to the center here. And refresh. Oh, I didn't. And let's do center. Save and refresh. Perfect. Now we have website made with love with a whole bunch of gibberish. But I wanted to show you that property float for images and make sure that we clear so it can start on the website on its own past the image. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. In this video, I want to talk about the box model in CSS. It's a very important concept, and it's something that you might have been kind of curious in the back of your head about. And that is this image right here. In CSS, we have this idea of the box model, which has the content, it has the padding, the border, which we've seen before, and then the margin. So we're going to talk about that in this video. So we have our not so pretty website right now, but I've left intentionally our login page still kind of blank. And you see that there's no styles applied to it because if we go to the login page, I'm going to drag it over here. It's referencing style 2, which doesn't have much styles happening. To really emphasize this point, I wanted to just, instead of the lorem ipsum, I'm going to create a div. If I give this a class of box model, I can go into my style 2, which I'm going to drag over here, and I can say box model border 5 pixels solid red. I save this and refresh. Okay, so we have our box model. Let's add something into this div. We have A, and right now it's covering the entire space, but if we add 3 more divs, we'll call this one B, the next one C. I save and refresh. Okay, we have these, and if we wanted them all in one line, then you might remember that that was display inline block, and I save, refresh, and there we have it. Okay, let's talk about the box model here. Let's say we wanted more space inside of these for the letters. Well, in that case, we can use something like padding. So padding, I can put 20 pixels, Save and refresh, and there's our padding. But let's say we want a different padding so that the sides are wider than the top. In that case, we can do something like 5 pixels at the top, 20 pixels on the right side, 5 pixels at the bottom, and 20 pixels to the left. I refresh, and look at that. And that's just a standard that you'll have to get used to. It's top, right, bottom, left. You can also actually do padding, as you can see in the drop-down, bottom, left, top, right to specify, but this is a quicker way of doing it. And if we remember, there was one more, and that was margin. So margin allows us to create space outside of the border. So if I go 20 pixels here and I save, refresh, you can see that we created 20 pixels on the left side and right side, but also the top and the bottom. Let's say we only want spaces between the boxes, but not at the top and bottom. Well, same principle again. We can do 0 pixels, 20 pixels, 0 pixels, and 20 pixels. So top, right, bottom, left. Save and refresh. There you go. Now, this might get tedious. There is one other shorthand way, and that is you can remove this. So this means top and bottom. This means left and right. I save this and refresh. Nothing should change, and it doesn't. And we can do the same at the top here as well. Perfect. One last thing I want to show you is that if we open up our developer tools, so again, we do inspect, you'll see in our styles that we have our box model. So if you see over here, we have our content, we have our padding, and it says 20 pixels, 5 pixels, 5 pixels. We have our border, 5 pixels, 5 pixels, 5 pixels, 5 pixels, and then our margin, 0 with 20 on the side. So again, Chrome allows you to browse around and make sure that all of these are properly done. The last thing you might ask is, what about this content? How can I change this? And that's very simple. You can do something like width. Let's do 33 pixels. Save and refresh. And also do height. Do 55 pixels. Save and refresh. And you'll see over here that in our box model, we now have the content with 33 pixels by 55 pixels. All right, that's it. Welcome back. Before we finish off this section, I wanted to show you one last thing. And that is, up until this point, we've used pixels quite a lot. But there's two other options that we can actually use. So let's remove our box models for now. And instead, let's create some paragraphs. So using our lorem shorthand, and let's close this off. Perfect. Let's say that we also wanted to have another paragraph that says introduction. Save and refresh. And there you go, we have our paragraph. Now, if we wanted to add some class to this paragraph, we can just go in here, and we don't need the box model, so we can delete that. We can do something like P, and let's do font size. And for font size, I've shown you that we can do percentages, but you can also do pixels. So let's do 20 pixels, save and refresh, and we have pixels. Okay, so let's say I want lorem ipsum to be a little bit bigger. You can use span. Again, that's kind of like the div tag that you've seen before. It's just good for inline. So again, this way we can add styles. So I save that, go to styles, and now we can select span. And we can do something like this. We can do font size 5 EM. I refresh. So what it's saying is we want the font size to be equal to 5 times the containing element, which is 20 pixels, because if you remember, we're inside of a p tag. Just to show you that that is right, if I do 100 pixels and save and refresh, it's the same. So EM is kind of nice because If I do something like 2em and refresh, well, if I change this to 10 pixels and I refresh, this always stays relative to the P. One other one I want to show you is REM, and that is the size in relation to the size of the root element. What is the root element? Well, it's the HTML. So whatever the document is, it's always going to be twice as big. So if I do 5 and refresh, that's great. But if I change the font size over here to 5, that won't be affected at all. Good job getting this far in the course. I know I've thrown a lot of properties and selectors at you, but I promise in the next section, we're going to start building some real websites and have fun with all this knowledge. Can't wait. See you.